Indigenous people in Canada, especially Indigenous women and girls, are in a state of emergency. So let's talk about this report that came out last month regarding the disappearance and trafficking of Indigenous people in Canada. In this report, it starts off with the scope of the problem. So, Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, although we only make up about 5% of the population, the 2014 National Task Force on Sex Trafficking and Women and Girls in Canada found that 51% of women and 50% of girls trafficked in Canada are Indigenous. And here's where it gets even more concerning. 75% of Indigenous girls under the age of 18 experience sexual abuse, with 50% of those being under the age of 14. The extreme overrepresentation of Indigenous women in sex trafficking, as well as the prevalence of gendered violence, points to a deep systemic problem. Now let's talk about the link between this and the foster care system. So we know that the foster care system in Canada has been a source of major issues when it comes to Indigenous people, especially in the broader context when we talk about harmful policies from the federal government, from residential schools, 60 Scoop. It has now just evolved through the modern day child welfare system. And because of that, it is leading into the root cause of a lot of these issues. For example, Indigenous children represent less than 8% of the Canadian population, but represent more than 50% of the kids in care. Foster care system is identified as a major pipeline to human trafficking, especially when it comes to kids that age out of care without the proper supports that they need, which we see in the number of children that have gone missing. There is often a link between them and their experience in dealing with child protection agencies or the foster care system. And survivors of trafficking have pointed out the link between them entering the system and them actually dealing with poverty over abuse. So here we see a map of Indigenous women disappearances from 2010 to present, and then also a heat map of Indigenous women disappearance from 2010 to present. And it outlines the three major centers of disappearances in the Prairie provinces: Winnipeg, Edmonton, and the Prince Albert, Regina, Saskatoon triangle. So when we talk about the disappearances occurring in these three Prairie provinces, it is important to note that the Prairie provinces account for 3 of the top 4 provinces in terms of Indigenous population. But this is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to these statistics and how we can actually dismantle this problem. But the emphasis on the foster care and child welfare system in general is so incredibly important because right now, First Nations across Canada are asserting their jurisdiction over Bill C-92, which gives the nation the capacity to actually manage their own children. And that is why it is so incredibly important for that work to be treated delicately and as a top priority, and people sitting at the table that not just have experience with the child welfare system, but people with social work backgrounds, but also people that understand the data piece of it, because this is systemic. There are multiple moving parts here that need to be addressed. But this is concerning.